Israel is on the verge of its greatest strategic victory since the 1967 Six-Day War. It's also in the midst of an attempted administrative coup to overthrow the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm going to have details on the latter coming up on In Focus. All right, so in the last two In Focuses, we talked about what was going on the ground in Syria following the overthrow of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. And I'm just going to spend a little bit of time giving you an update on that on the ground. So the first thing I want to say is that, Israel is now on the peak of the Hermon mountain range, and it's taken over the formerly demilitarized zone that it had agreed to with the Assad regime in 1974, that the UN was supposed to be in charge of. But when the jihadists who have taken over most of Syria tried to or began attacking U.S. forces in the demilitarized zone, Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered the army to go in and take it over, and that's what happened. And Israel has established a demilitarized zone that roughly borders about 6 Druze villages along the border with Israel inside of Syria. And what just happened over the weekend or on Friday, I'm not quite sure, is that the heads of those villages, those Druze villages, asked Israel to annex them into Israel's sovereign territory, that they prefer to be part of Israel than part of this new jihadist state in the making that's being led by an ISIS alumni, Al-Qaeda alumni named al-Golani. So that's what's happening. There was also indication that the Yazidis of Syria want to be annexed into Israel. Obviously, this is all something that's going to have to be determined over time. But basically what it speaks to, the Druze request, is the earthquake in the Middle East as a result of the war that Israel was forced to respond to when we were invaded on October 7th. Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, said that on October 7th they were going to change the face of the Middle East, and they did, because the Iranian axis that Hamas is a member of is being destroyed before our eyes. First Hamas, then Hezbollah. Assad fell. Iran's anti-aircraft batteries are all destroyed. And basically, with Israel in control of areas in South Syria, we now have a clear flight path, uninhibited flight path to Iran's nuclear installations that can be attacked essentially at will, so long as Israel has the armaments to do so. Beyond that, the Iranians are now really scared. So there's a Barron's report. You can see the headline here, where Iran is on a charm offensive with the Americans, with the UN. They're saying, oh, yeah, we're going to open up all of our nuclear sites to international inspections. Right. Sure. Tell it to the judge. Anyway, so they're scared. They're on a charm offensive. And then Hamas seems to be willing to make a hostage deal because they're out, open, and exposed. Hezbollah's out of the game. Assad is out of the game. Hezbollah leader Naim Qassam, he announced that in a speech on Saturday that Hezbollah supply lines from Syria have been cut off because of the fall of the Assad regime, which is a big deal in and of itself. It means that they can't get resupplied, at least not easily, so they're likely to maintain the ceasefire for now unless things change. So that's a positive indicator, and it's a negative one for Hamas, which is why it seems like chances of reaching some sort of a hostage deal are higher now than they've been in the past, and we'll just have to see how that plays out. But Hamas is very much exposed. And inside of Judea and Samaria, where it seems like that is going to now become the hot front in this war, they just murdered a 12-year-old boy on a bus last week. When he was on a bus traveling back from celebrating his sister's wedding with his family going home to Jerusalem, and he was murdered in a shooting at the public bus that he was traveling on. And there's been a rash of attempted assaults, attacks, terrorist attacks by Palestinian terrorists who are armed to the teeth by the Iranians, and there's some sort of military struggle going on between Fatah, which is supplied and armed and paid for by the United States, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad over who's going to be in charge. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, is 89 years old and has been sick for quite some time, and he appointed a young successor who's merely 75 years old. All the same, that's what's happening in the Palestinian arena, and everything is kind of falling apart. All of Israel's enemies are falling apart. And the architect of all of this has been Prime Minister Netanyahu. If it hadn't been for Netanyahu, under American pressure, Israel probably would never have really fought this war. We might have done some sound and light show after October 7th and sued for a ceasefire that would bring us some of the hostages back. But that was what the Americans anticipated, that they would let Israel, burn off some steam, blow up some buildings in Gaza, and then we would agree to a ceasefire, and we would get a few of the hostages back, the children, as we did most of the children in November of last year, and the rest of them, we'd have to wait. Maybe if Israel gave up Judea and Samaria, then Hamas would give us some of the other hostages back. But that was basically the American goal, which is why they gave Israel arms, but then they stopped giving us arms as soon as they could and started the arms slowed down and were preventing us from taking offensive action further as we were moving south in Gaza, et cetera. So the person who stood up to them, the person who insisted that we keep going in this war the entire time, sometimes completely by himself, against the subversion, the subversive acts of his defense minister all along the line, and the IDF chief of staff, and the IDF general staff, and the head of Shabak, Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, and others who were demanding that Israel agree to a ceasefire and not continue to fight, was Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. If it hadn't been for him, I think it's fairly clear to most of the public that Israel would not have come this far. We wouldn't have achieved what we've achieved in all of these theaters, and we wouldn't be facing a situation where, again, as I said at the outset, we're poised to achieve our greatest strategic victory since 1967 in the Six-Day War. So it's all because of Netanyahu, and it's at this time where we're just 36 days away from January 20th, when Biden is replaced by President Donald Trump, that Israel's administrative state, particularly our legal fraternity, and then the general staff of the army, with this active support, both with the active support of the media, are doing everything that they can to try to oust Netanyahu from power. So what we're seeing most blatantly is what's happening in his trial. And I've spoken about this in recent In Focuses with you, but I just want to recap. So over 4 years, from 2020 until 2024, in August, the prosecution presented its case in Netanyahu's trial. If you remember, he's indicted on 3 charges, 3 counts. One is accepting a bribe, and the other 2 are these nebulous charges of breach of trust. And the bribe charge fell apart completely. The judges told the prosecution last year, look, you might want to revisit this idea. You haven't made your case. We think you should drop the charge of bribery. But the only reason that he was indicted in the first place is because they had a concocted bribery charge that was absurd on its face, and it required to even be accepted complete revision of the bribery statute post facto without, any support from the Knesset. Like, the bribery statute talks about bribery, accepting bribes being accepting money. And here Netanyahu was charged with bribery for what they claimed was he accepted untoward openness on the part of a hostile media organization to his requests for better coverage, when in fact, the whole thing was absurd. What does that even mean? Nothing. It's all nebulous. It's just a moving target, so that anything that Netanyahu does, you can say that that was criminal. Why? Because he's Netanyahu. So it was an idea of, okay, this is the target, Netanyahu. We'll do anything that we can to try to incriminate him with some felonious charge. And that's what they did by rewriting the bribery statute in a way that they could charge him with it. And even their attempt to redefine what bribery is, to say that it had something to do with untoward relations between Netanyahu and a media outlet, which is, again, it's insane. But they made this claim and they charged him with bribery on the basis of this claim. Even that fell apart on the witness stand. The prosecution wasn't able to make its case that Netanyahu had received anything from the media outlet in question, or that he had given anything to the owner of the media outlet in order to gain what he didn't receive. So the whole thing fell apart. And the judges said to the prosecutors, we think that you should drop this charge. The prosecutors refused, and they said, we'll get him in the defense, you'll see. And then the other two charges are that he breached trust by accepting too many gifts, legal gifts from his friends. That fell apart because they showed that he had actually gotten a tenth of the gifts that the prosecutors claimed he had received. And the third one was that he had breached the public trust by not saying that the publisher of Yediot Ahronot, Israel's then largest, or still not then, but second largest circulation newspaper, Yediot Ahronot, that he had received a request for a bribe, or that the publisher of Yediot Ahronot, Arnon Moses, had offered him a bribe, and he didn't tell anybody that he was supposed to report that he had been offered a bribe, which he didn't accept. But his crime, his breach of trust, was that he didn't tell anybody that there was a bribe, and the prosecutors failed to make their case in that because it wasn't at all clear that Netanyahu realized that he was being bribed. More likely, in fact, he thought he was being extorted, but there was no cognizance of being offered a bribe, and therefore there was no possibility that he breached the trust because he didn't realize that he was being he had any reporting requirements under the statute. So the point is that the prosecution's case failed, but they won't revoke any of the charges. They won't dismiss the charges. The judges won't dismiss the charges. They can't, because the purpose of the case is numerous media luminaries and the former superintendent of the police who was responsible for the investigations of Netanyahu said, and the former attorney general who was responsible for indicting Netanyahu have all acknowledged that the purpose of the indictment wasn't to try Netanyahu, it was to force him to cop a plea under the terms of which he would resign from public office. So that the entire prosecution of Netanyahu, they themselves have acknowledged, was not geared towards actually convicting him of any of these fake crimes that they made up in order to oust him, but rather it was to oust him from power. And they figured he was going to cop a plea, and they would demand that in exchange for a plea bargain that would prevent him or accept that he wasn't going to jail on their part, that he would accept some sort of a conviction that he and his punishment would be that he resigned. And in the event, Netanyahu refused to accept a plea deal. It was on the table, it was being seriously negotiated some 4 years ago, and Netanyahu turned over the tables and he said, no, I'm not going to accept the plea deal. And he didn't. And the trial went on, and he's been beating the charges. So since the purpose of the trial is political, it's obvious that the prosecution isn't going to take back any of the charges. They're not going to cancel any of the charges on the indictment, and the judges aren't going to dismiss the trial, because if they do, then they're basically betraying their guild, the legal fraternity, by acknowledging that what was just done was an act of political warfare against the prime minister, and that in itself is a crime because it's subversion, it's whatever. I mean, you can, if you want to, you can say this is a target. Let's define the crime, but there are actually many serious felonies inside of the law books that are in fact applicable to a situation where the state prosecution is abusing its powers in order to try to incriminate and oust from office a sitting prime minister. It's a coup. It's an administrative coup. But they are going ahead with these charges, and the defense opened up its case last week. And the defense's first witness is Netanyahu. So first, I want to talk to you a second about Netanyahu. Why, most defense counsels do everything in their power to prevent their client from having to take to the witness stand, because the fear is that your client could inadvertently incriminate himself by misspeaking, by perjuring himself inadvertently, because he isn't in command of all of the details of his case, and therefore it's a very risky move to put a defendant on the witness stand, because you don't know how he might get tricked up, particularly obviously in cross-examination by the prosecutor. So it's a risky move, but Netanyahu is the prime minister. So from his perspective, since this is a political trial, and it's obvious that it's a political trial because the charges themselves are absurd and they've already been exposed as totally frivolous and wrong and empty, he feels that he has to present his case to the public, because that's the real judge in this case, the people who made him prime minister. It's not the judges in the district court in Jerusalem. They're sitting in Tel Aviv because it's a protected room. It's a bomb shelter, and he's obviously under threat, having, ordered the killing of all of Hezbollah's leadership, et cetera. A lot of people wanted to kill him. He's considered the one of three most threatened people on the face of the planet. He, Netanyahu, the Pope, and the President of the United States. And so, it's very dangerous in time of war for him to be in an open courtroom. So they're having it in a bomb shelter in the district court of Tel Aviv. All the same, these three district judges from Jerusalem won't dismiss the charges because it would be socially destructive for them to do so and professionally destructive for them to do so. So Netanyahu, from his perspective, realizes that these judges aren't going to give him a fair shake, but the people who give him a fair shake are the public. So he has to go on the witness stand in order to defend himself. And now let's talk about the timing. So Netanyahu, under all circumstances, would want to go and take the stand and defend himself. But why now? Why at one of the most strategically dangerous moments in Israel's history is Netanyahu taking to the witness stand? And not only that, the court has required him to testify 3 times a week, each time for 6 hours. So they're taking him out of commission as the Prime Minister of Israel in time of war, while he's leading the country along 7 fronts, right? For 18 hours a week, 3 times a week. And not only that, they said, well, if you miss one day because you have to be prime minister, like last week, he had to miss at least part of the day of testimony because Paraguay opened its embassy in Jerusalem, and he had to be there for the embassy opening and for the ceremony at the Knesset. Well, then you have to make it up. You have to have an extra day. So it's not like they won't, they're like, they treat him like a pupil in detention at school or even worse. And because they're treating him like a criminal, not like a prime minister. In fact, the Yehudit Tirosh, who's one of the prosecutors in the case, so she referred to him in the courtroom as accused number 1. And the defense attorney, Amit Haddad, looked at her and he said, you address him as prime minister. He's the prime minister. And she said, not in this courtroom. In this courtroom, he's accused number 1. All right, so that's the way that's the contempt with which he is being treated by the court, by the prosecutors. So why is it that they're doing this at this level of intensity at this time? And I think that there are basically 3 reasons for it. So the first reason that they're doing it is because they think, as they told the judges when they refused to remove the bribery charge after it had been exposed last year as scurrilous, as totally, unfounded, is because they're hoping that he trips himself up. That they're thinking, okay, he's prime minister, he's got the war on his head, he's got his coalition that he has to maintain, he's got, 1,500,000, things that he has to do today because they're all, about Israel's national survival, Israel's international position, the survival of his coalition. Everything that a prime minister has to do and prime minister of Israel in times of war has to do, he has to do all of those things. So he's distracted by his job. So what we're going to do is pull him away from his job, and he can't possibly be prepared well enough in order not to slip up. And so we're going to put him on a witness stand at a time when he has a million things that he has to deal with, because that's the time when he's most vulnerable to incriminating himself in some way. And that's what we're planning to do. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we're putting all of our hopes on, that he's going to trip himself up and then we're going to get him. And that's their plan. That's their only plan. That's their game plan. So that's one thing, as I said to the judges last year. The second thing, is that they want him to look bad, right? So Netanyahu, he's the prime minister. We see him, dealing with the Americans. We see him in the cabinet war room. We see him here. We see him there as the prime minister. And then suddenly we're going to be seeing him brought low as accused number 1. They're going to humiliate him 3 times a week. He's going to be in this position where he's the accused and he's testifying on his own behalf. And it's going to make the public, feel contempt for him. So far that's completely backfired. Channel 14 published a direct polls survey of public opinion this week, and it found that Netanyahu is more popular now than he has been in the past, that the Likud, which had 32 seats, I think, in 2022, is now up to 34 seats. He himself is beating all comers. He's, for suitability for prime minister, he's well above 50%, 52, 54% against his main contenders, Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, that are in the low 20s or 20, 21%. So he's more than twice, much more than twice supported than they are by the public. So, and his numbers are going up to unprecedented levels. So just as, the Justice Department, the Biden administration thought that if they indicted Trump, on everything and, with charges that would land him in the big house, for the rest of his life, and then a couple more lifetimes, that would make the American people reject him as a candidate for president, and it would bury him, and, they might get him in jail or whatever, or get him killed, then, and that actually boomeranged. And what it did more than anything else was cause his reelection, because the American people, this is what the data show, were so revolted by the lawfare against Trump that it made them more supportive of him than they might have otherwise been. So the same is the case with Netanyahu, that our administrative states, our state prosecutions, our justice ministries, our attorney general's efforts to wage lawfare against the prime minister in an administrative coup is actually getting the public more supportive of Netanyahu. So it's the exact same phenomena at play in the United States. This is in play from everything that's done. And the third goal, the third, hope that they have in forcing him on the witness stand at this time, 3 times a week, 6 hours a day, is to get him declared unfit to lead and oust him from power. Now, how would that work? Well, if he gets too many notes passed to him by his military attaché in the middle of the courthouse, which is what happened last week. He had, I think, 3 different times they had to go into break so that he could deal with pressing security concerns about hostage negotiations or about Syria or what have you. So the idea is that if he gets messages brought to him too often in the course of his testimony, that then the judges will get mad, and some left-wing NGO like the U.S.-funded Movement for Quality Government or the Association for Civil Rights in Israel or some other NGO will petition the Supreme Court and demand that the Supreme Court find Netanyahu unfit to serve as prime minister, because he can't be prime minister and be accused number 1 or defendant number 1 at the same time. And since it's obviously more important to the public interest for him to be answering questions about how many bottles of champagne he received from Arnon Milchan or how many cigars he got from him than to wage the war to successful conclusion, then obviously the Supreme Court justices are going to have to find him unfit to lead so that he can devote all of his time and energies to being accused number 1 in the courtroom in Tel Aviv in the bomb shelter there. So that's the basic concept, that they're going to be able to get him ousted from power by forcing him to testify in a manner that undermines his ability to serve as prime minister. So far, like I said, it's not working for them. And the weekend papers, all of the what would you call them, collaborators with this judicial effort to oust Netanyahu from power, were bemoaning this fact, and they were attacking him harshly, saying Netanyahu is no good because he's, for his own personal reasons, because he's selfish, he refused to accept a plea deal that would end this saga and oust him from power. So that simply by clinging to office, right, he's bad. Like there's no war that he's winning that nobody else would have ever fought to this point, and they would have given up, in November under American pressure, right? And he's refused, and he keeps going, and now he's 36 days away from Trump, right? And they're desperate to get him out before then, and they're attacking him, saying that he's no good, he's a traitor or whatever because he refuses to leave office in a plea deal, right? He's ruining their plans. And then, you have, again, this direct polls survey that came out on Channel 14. So, the numbers don't lie. they asked the public, okay, do you believe that the attorney general's, that her name is Gali Barav Miara, do you believe that Gali Barav Miara's determination that he has to give his testimony now undermines national security? And, 54% of Israelis said yes, that her decision to force him to go on the witness stand in time of war undermines Israel's national security, is detrimental to Israel's national security. 45% said no, it doesn't undermine national security, and only 1% said they don't know. And then they also asked, is the prosecution using the trial in order to undermine the right-wing government? And here, too, 53% of Israelis said, yes, indeed, this is a political prosecution. The point of it is to undermine the right-wing government. 45% said no, 2% said they didn't know. And finally, when you talk about whether or not this is political or not political, so, or you look at the weekend paper saying that Netanyahu is no good because he refuses to quit. So Channel 14 direct polls asked the public, do you think that the president should pardon Netanyahu to end the trial and so put an end to the domestic political polarization inside of the country? Which is an interesting question. I hadn't even thought of that, and Netanyahu was certainly not going to ask for a pardon. And the answer here was very clear. Clear. It's the same thing. It's a divided, polarized public, right? So 46% of the public says, yes, President Herzog should pardon Netanyahu to put an end to this saga. And then, 43% said no. So, and the rest don't know. So the point here is that, the public is polarized over this. A significant majority of Israelis are with Netanyahu. A significant but much smaller minority are with the legal fraternity. And they want to oust Netanyahu through this administrative coup, which is why they support it, right? So, but again, a majority is a majority in a democracy, and 54% is a lot. And Netanyahu's coalition is at 63 seats in the poll over the weekend, where his party, his Likud faction, is more than twice the size of the next larger faction, right? And so he's very much representing the will of the people. And the more that they attack him, the more he represents it. But they don't care. And this would be bad enough, right? This would be bad enough, but. This isn't all that they're doing. They're also, the IDF is also trying to undermine Netanyahu. So it's interesting because over the weekend or towards the end of last week, I think actually over the weekend, two different stories came out. One was the sort of Stalinist investigative report by journalist Ilana Dayan called Uvda, which means fact, which does in fact sound like or is reminiscent of Pravda, the Soviet press organ. Anyway, so Ilana Dayan did this really weird investigative report where she was giving this top secret minutes of conversations that were held by Netanyahu with his military attaché on October 7th, Abigail, and then that were saying one thing, and then she was talking to the same left-wing generals that have been undermining or trying to overthrow the government since it was elected in November 22nd, 2022, on the other hand, to try to incriminate Netanyahu and blame him for October 7th. So it was really sort of an interesting thing. So first of all, to the facts. So Ilana Dayan said, and not for the first time, she reported that the head of the Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, and the IDF chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, had, beginning in March of 2023, insisted to Netanyahu a number of times that the judicial reform that his government wanted to undertake or was undertaking at the time was going to cause a war. Now, this is a political statement. It's got nothing to do with military information. And in fact, the prime minister, each time that he was warned, the last time was just a couple of days before the war, was, well, what are the indications that the enemy is about to attack us? And they had none. So that's how you knew that this was political extortion rather than an actual military alert that they were giving the prime minister. But they were wrapping it up in this wrapping paper of a military threat. At the same time, they continued to tell the prime minister that Hamas was deterred, that Hamas was not intending to go to war, and that what Israel needed to do to prevent another outbreak of violence with Hamas was to give Gazans more work permits in the border areas, in the kibbutzim, and in Sderot and in other places, and also to allow Qatar to give more cash to the Hamas regime in Gaza. So they wanted to continue appeasing and up the ante of what Israel was allowing Qatar to give and what Israel was going to give to stabilize Hamas's grip on power and empower and enrich Hamas. So that was their thing with Hamas, but they kept giving these amorphous claims. And in the meantime, if we remember, beginning around March 2023, or maybe even before that, you had these generals, these retired generals, these retired IDF chiefs of staff, and these activists who were reserve officers, reserve pilots in the Air Force, reserve commanders in commando units, particularly Sayeret Matkal, which is associated with the left and is therefore claimed to be touted as the greatest commando unit in Israel. It's also the commando unit that the Prime Minister served in and his older brother Yoni Netanyahu served in and commanded during the Entebbe raid, where he was killed freeing hostages in 1976 from Palestinian terrorists. And so the Sayeret Matkal and the reserve pilots were pushing this operation to take apart, to dismantle the IDF by refusing to serve in reserves. And they were never really called out by the leadership of the IDF, not by Herzl Halevi, not by the Air Force commander Tomer Ron, not by anybody. And Tomer Bar, nobody was calling them out. So they're dismantling the IDF's reserve corps, which is the main thing that the IDF relies on to fight wars, as we've seen over the past year and 2 months. And they're calling for people not to serve in reserves. And they're having massive rallies calling for people not to serve in reserves. And nobody's being investigated by the police. This is a criminal, this is a crime, this is a felony. It's, inciting a rebellion in the IDF. That's a serious felony. It's very close to treason. And yet nobody was ever investigated for this. And Netanyahu is screaming out against it, saying, you got to stop it. Why aren't you stopping it? Why? He's saying to Gali Bar Miar, why aren't you investigating it? And she wasn't investigating it. And Tomer Bar and Herzl Halevi were doing nothing more than like sort of one weak criticism of what was happening, but nobody was thrown out of the army. Nobody was thrown out of reserves. Nobody was really disciplined for any of this stuff. Okay, so they're using this refusal to serve in the IDF as a means to then tell Netanyahu to be the instruments of the extortion, coming to the prime minister like mafia bosses saying, nice army you got there, be a real shame if something happened to it. And by the way, if something happens to it, as it is now happening, right, because people aren't serving in reserves, then we're going to be facing a major war. That was what they were saying to the prime minister. But they didn't say anything about Hamas. And in a second report that came out, I think on Saturday night, Omri Maniv from Channel 12 came out with more information about all of the explicit warnings that the chief of staff of the army, the head of intelligence, the head of Southern Command, the head of the Shin Bet received from the field saying, look, Hamas is preparing for war. Look, there's this plan that we intercepted. We called it the Walls of Jericho. Look, they're training for it. This isn't a theoretical plan like you claim. Look, in June 2023, they had a massive training rehearsal for the invasion. It's imminent. It's going to happen anytime. It's going to be an act of historic proportions. They got explicit warnings, and you had these NCOs and intelligence officers from the Gaza division who were basically, jumping up and down and screaming, take this seriously. And Herzl Halevi didn't take it seriously. Aaron Khaliwa wasn't taking it seriously. The previous commander of the Southern Command, General Toledano, wasn't taking it seriously. And then, Finkelstein, who had the unfortunate honor of being the chief, the commander of Southern Command, beginning 3 months before October 7th, also wasn't clear on why this was supposed to be taken seriously. Maniv also reported that former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was actually given information about the Walls of Jericho plan when he came to the Gaza division to say goodbye as he was leaving the premiership in May, I think, of 2022, and he didn't take it seriously either. But Netanyahu himself was never informed of it. So Ilana Dayan, back to, so Omri Maniv deepened our understanding that there's really no way to avoid the conclusion that the heads of the IDF and the Shin Bet, they're responsible for Israel's failure to prevent October 7th. They had all of the information, warning after warning after warning, report after report after report. There was a drill in the Southern Command, but I think it was the paratroopers that participated in it to block precisely the kind of invasion that Israel experienced on October 7th, and they failed. And then General Toledano, who was in charge of the Southern Command at his time, this is what Maniv reported, said it's not a big deal because it's not a serious scenario that we're taking seriously. That's not the scenario that we're taking seriously, so it's okay that you failed. We'll get them once they cross the fence, which, of course, we didn't, right? And so, the IDF just dismissed the seriousness of all of these warnings. So it's very apparent from everything that we've already learned that the Army, the Chief of Staff, the head of intelligence, Toledano, who's a former head of Southern Command to a degree as well, Finkelman, who's a serving head of the Southern Command, the division commander of Gaza division commander, and others, the head of operations, they were responsible for October 7th from Israel's perspective. They didn't block it. And most importantly, they never told Netanyahu about any of this. They never told him about the walls of Jericho. They never informed the National Security Council. They never informed him about Hamas's training to carry out the walls of Jericho. Nothing. They didn't tell him anything at all. And so he was left in the dark. And they knew everything and disregarded the warnings, completely disregarded the warnings. And they told the prime minister, on the one hand, that the warnings for war owed to his government's political plan to reform the courts. They were extorting him politically, saying that the army's going to just fall apart and we're not going to do anything to prevent it, so long as you maintain your plan to reform the judiciary in Israel. So they're working hand in glove with the state prosecutors and the judges here. And then they didn't tell him anything except the way to block Hamas from stop being deterred, to stop deterring Hamas is to stop paying them off, right? And so pay them off more, you'll get more deterrence. I mean, it's a stupid thing. Obviously, you're not deterring anybody if you're bribing them. Bribery is not a form of deterrence, but that's another issue for another day, that they don't even know what deterrence is. All the same, 6:29 in the morning is the first time that Netanyahu ever heard anything about the threat from Hamas. That is when Hamas actually began its strike. At 6:29 in the morning, his military attaché, Avi Gil, calls him up, wakes him up, and says, "Mr. Prime Minister, we're under missile assault." Okay, and I think from my perspective, the most horrible thing about this whole report is that Netanyahu says to him, "Why are they attacking us?" That's his first response. Why are they attacking us? Because he had no information. And then he said to him, "I don't see anything in the intelligence briefing to indicate that that they were planning on attacking us." They said that 11 minutes later at a second call that they had at 6:40. So the prime minister asked the right question. Why are they attacking us? And then he said to him, says, "Why are they attacking at 6:29? Just something 11 minutes." He said, "We had no warning. I don't see anything in the intelligence reporting." And then he said, "We need to see the breadth of the attack. And if we have to mobilize the reserves, we need to convene as quickly as possible the general staff." So Netanyahu is responding to the information, and he's giving the exact right response. We have to convene the general staff. He was the first one to arrive at headquarters like 20 minutes after he hung up the phone with his military attaché. Nobody else was there yet. Herzl Halevi, I think, traipsed in at like 8 o'clock in the morning. So Netanyahu is sitting there with his staff officers, right? And he had no information. They had hidden all of this information from him. They never told him anything. And his initial responses are correct. And then he said they might try to kidnap somebody. When he finally got the indication that they were actually crossing the border, he said this may be in order to kidnap people. So everything that the prime minister is saying, remember, I didn't tell you this now, but I'll just recall that there were 2 conversations of the heads of the IDF and Ronen Bar from the Shin Bet, one at midnight, one at 4 o'clock in the morning, when they were getting more and more indications that Hamas was about to invade, and they didn't wake up the prime minister, and they didn't wake up the defense minister either. So they had all of these clear indications of an imminent invasion, and they didn't call the prime minister to alert him. Imagine if he had had the same responses at 4 o'clock in the morning. They would have woken up the guards. They would have started sending reservists down to the Gaza border in order to reinforce it at 4 o'clock or at midnight. And I mean, we know this because we see what he said at 6:30 in the morning when he was just getting in the information. Imagine if he had prior warning, just a couple of hours, things would have looked very different on October 7th for certain. So Channel 12, so Uvda comes out with this report, this investigative report, that's supposed to incriminate Netanyahu and blame him for October 7th, but the facts that they presented all spoke to reinforcing the already apparent conclusion, which is that the IDF general staff, led by Herzia Levy and Aaron Khaliwa, the head of military intelligence, and Ronen Bar in the Shin Bet, they blocked all of this information from the prime minister. Their judgment on absolutely everything was totally wrong. And at the same time, they were extorting the prime minister politically by siding with, refusing to take action against widespread refusal to serve in reserves by pilots and by the commando officers. And in the event on October 7th, you had these heroes who are sprinting literally to the border to defend the communities that are being overrun, right, and dying. And nothing from the Air Force, nothing. No operation, nobody, they had nothing. The Air Force didn't show up. So you're looking at this situation and you see which army actually showed up, not the general staff, not the Air Force, and not reservists from these units. No, it was soldiers and reservists who just took it upon themselves and they went. It was a disaster of epic proportions on every level, operationally and otherwise. And the prime minister, who had never been informed of it, he was the one who showed up. And now they're trying to frame him by saying, look, we were using political extortion of the army in order to force you not to reform our partners in the deep state and the judiciary, right? And therefore, we get off the hook for not warning you about the war. Because look, we actually did, but they didn't. Like he said, when they said to him, that the legal reform is causing the war, he said, where? Who's going to attack? And they didn't have an answer to that. So, and the answer is, we just want to oust you from power. And so their public relations strategy of putting him in the dock has failed. The public is more supportive of him now than they were before. They think that these people are undermining national security, not the prime minister for defending himself. They're angry about the trial, right? And the media aspect of this with the IDF that are putting out these top secret protocols on these primetime reports, right? That's backfiring too, because you have all the same generals who have been out in the streets and calling for civil war, saying that it's all Netanyahu's fault. Well, how surprising that they would say that to mere part of the former head of Mossad, Ehud Barak, the former defense minister and prime minister and chief of staff of the army, who's really been like the motor behind all of this. They're saying that Netanyahu is terrible, that he's responsible. How surprising. But in the meantime, the transcripts of the minutes of these protocols are all saying that Netanyahu was the hero of the day and that the chief of staff of the army totally failed and that the Shin Bet totally failed. So it's a very strange thing. They keep thinking that it doesn't matter. And in a way it doesn't, because they're so powerful. They have no constraints on their power, no limits on their power. So they figure they can get away with everything. Last week, Channel 14 revealed this incredible story, which is that Gali Baharav Miara's son, so the attorney general's son, was called up for reserves. I think he's in a tank battalion, and they were sent to the north to man the border. And apparently this was at the beginning of the war, so in October of 23. And apparently he was thrown out of his position for something that he did. And everybody was there on emergency orders. And there was a soldier who had gotten emergency orders. He came from the United States. He lives in the United States. He came to Israel. He heard that there were shortages on equipment, so he bought out of his own pocket $2,700. He bought a ceramic bulletproof vest for him to use in the war that he was about to go into. So he brings this ceramic vest with him from the United States that he bought. and he brings it to reserve duty along the northern border, and it got stolen. It was stolen, and they discovered it was stolen because they were called immediately to the border because there was an alert and da-da-da-da. So everybody's putting on their bulletproof vests. The soldier comes to get his vest that he brought special from America, and it's not there. So then they discover after 2 days that there's actually a video camera of where all of the equipment was being held, and lo and behold, it was Barav Miar's son who stole his ceramic vest. And walked away with it. Put it in a garbage bag, put a towel over the garbage bag, and walked away with it on his way home because he was dismissed from reserves, apparently. And under the normal circumstances, you would open up a criminal investigation. Military police is stealing military equipment. It's a serious offense. But no probe was ever undertaken. He was not court-martialed. He was not investigated. And the soldier never got his vest back, even though everybody knew that Gali Barav Miar's son was the one who did it. Why? Well, the battalion commander is an officer who works in a large law firm called Shibboleth in Tel Aviv, and the head of his department is a guy named Yossi Bental. Yossi Bental is very connected, and he called up the soldier whose equipment was stolen from him and basically said, well, I'm sorry, nothing can be done about it, real sorry, blah, blah, blah. He was representing her son, right? And so it works out that Shibboleth law firm also is putting out all of these statements, just the latest one in November last month, saying, protecting Barav Miar from calls for her to be fired and warning all the politicians to shut up and stop threatening her and saying that this was an attack against an assault on democracy, all of their criticism of Barav Miara and her behavior, and you can't have that, and you can't criticize the Attorney General. And Bental himself was called up for reserves to prepare generals like Khaliwa to defend themselves against operational inquiries that the IDF was conducting over the failures of October 7th. So, he's connected. He's also apparently the counsel of the Qatar Foundation in Israel, so he makes a lot of money from Qatar. And as the representative of the Qatar Foundation, he's also on the team for the hostage negotiation. So this all just came out last week. And really what we learn from this more than anything else is that these people really are immune. They live in in a parallel universe where they can do anything, where their family members can do anything. Liad Ben-Ari, who's the chief prosecutor in Netanyahu's trial, who doesn't even bother to show up for any of the hearings, she was exposed as having, committed a crime. Like she and her husband they bought a property that under the code that they bought it under, it had to be a residential property, and they turned it into a rental property. And they got off scot-free for that. Why? Because these people, and judges are always shown to have, operated in breach of trust, taking on cases that they're not allowed to take on because they have siblings or whatever that are involved in it, and they don't care. And they don't have to because nobody does anything against them. And in the meantime, here you see, while Israel is in the midst of a war for its survival, we're on the verge of a massive strategic victory, and we're being led by Netanyahu in this war. He's being blamed for October 7th when he didn't have any prior warning that it was going to happen, and the people who didn't do anything to prevent it. That's the IDF. And he is now being forced to take the witness stand 18 hours a week for, the foreseeable future, because to talk about criminal charges that already fell apart during the prosecution's presentation of the charges against him. And you look at it and you think, where are we going? What is going on? So you have this administrative state made up of the legal fraternity, the senior leadership of the IDF and the Shin Bet and, and perhaps the Mossad and the media that's colluding with them. And they're trying to oust the prime minister at this time in our history because they see an opportunity because he's distracted. And you say, this just can't go on. And I think that, I don't know how it's going to shake out. What's clear to me is that, America and the United States have these rare leaders in Trump and in Netanyahu. I can't imagine another American president who would have been able to withstand the kind of pressure that's been brought to bear on Trump, including the attempts to kill him. And Netanyahu is the exact same way. You know, he's come under a lot of criticism over the years for not directly taking on the deep state. He's not doing anything. Look, he failed. And some of that criticism is valid, but we have to look at what he's doing here. You know, he takes them on by just continuing to implement his policies, by continuing to be elected and then not becoming a leftist. I mean, Sharon became a leftist when they threatened him, and Olmer became a leftist, and, you know, Ruby Rivlin, who's a former president, became a leftist, and many others. They all just changed their politics completely to, you know, go lockstep with our deep state, which is radical left, in order to get out from under the legal charges. And Netanyahu's the only one who says, bring it on. No, I'll just stand trial. Yeah, I'll go break, whatever. You're not letting me raise money for my legal defense from anybody, so okay. You know, he had a lawyer who basically tried to extort him and said that I'm not going to represent you anymore if you keep going with the legal thing. And he's no longer representing Netanyahu, and Netanyahu keeps going. I don't know where this is going to go, but I don't think these people are going to succeed. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I don't actually see Netanyahu either quitting or his government falling. They're looking at these polls, and it's obvious for the people in Likud that they have no political future without Netanyahu. The coalition certainly is not going to get a better coalition than what they have now. So they're not going to leave the government. None of this is going to work for them. But, you know, as they go from failure to failure, they become more radicalized and more nutty. You know, there's nothing we can do about it. We just have to deal with it and keep going. And, you know, thankfully, we are being led by Netanyahu in the United States. Trump just won. And I think 36 days are going to come and go. We'll finally see these two, you know, Moby Dicks meeting in the blue ocean and leading us to safety and a new strategic reality that's going to protect Israel and the United States and our, you know, partners for the next several generations. Anyway, that's my hope, and that's also my belief. And I'll come back later this week, both with more interviews and also with more information about what's happening. Probably next time it'll be on the strategic issues, but I had to let you know what's going on here. So anyway, I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.